Welcome to One Work, Five Questions, episode 76. Oh, I like that number, 76, my favorite. Today's episode is on Thomas Jefferson's Kentucky Resolution, dated 1798. First, I'd like to give you a little background on Dr. Holacek. He's a retired professor of philosophy and history who taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University, Camden, and Ohio University. And he has over 27 published books on Thomas Jefferson and over 200 essays on Jefferson. Wow. The numbers just keep growing. And we have a special guest today with us, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him as I introduce the topic. The Alien and Sedition Acts were 4 acts made law in 1798 by John Adams's administration in response to concerns of Francophilia in the United States and the perceived possibility of the overthrow of the U.S. government. The Naturalization Act, repealed in 1802, made it difficult to seek citizenship. Alien Friends Act soon expired. The federal government could imprison and deport non-citizens. Alien Enemies Act, which is still in effect, the federal government could detain non-citizens during times of war. And the Sedition Act, which soon expired, false or malicious statements about the federal government was sufficient for imprisonment. From 1798 to 1800, the U.S. was in a quasi-war with France. The acts, the Sedition Act especially, worked unsurprisingly against certain large or outspoken Republicans who were often the targets of seditious speech or actions. Jefferson, then vice president, was irate and conspired with Madison to rally support for their unconstitutionality. Jefferson wrote resolutions to be placed before Kentucky's legislature. Madison, Virginia's legislature. Just what did Jefferson write on the draft of his resolutions put forth to Kentucky's legislature by John Breckinridge? We're happy to have with us, here's his introduction, Dr. Clifford Humphrey, who has a unique take on the influence of the Virginia resolutions of Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions. Donna.
I hope we really have him because he's gone in and out. Maybe this is just a hologram and not the real Clifford.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I forgot it was going to be changing the view. Yeah, I'm trying to remember to find a way to put my notes up here. But yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay.
All right.
I'm Donna Vitek, and this is One Work, Five Questions, episode 76. But before beginning, I remind listeners the aim of the program. We look at one particular writing of Thomas Jefferson and either examine it thoroughly to see what other scholars have not seen, or we critically analyze some portion of the letter as a springboard for further discussion. And please, if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Okay, are you ready for question number 1?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Clifford, Dr. Humphreys, just to give us a couple minutes just about who you are.
Okay.
And your interest in Thomas Jefferson. We'll get to the first question. How's that?
Excellent.
Sure. Yeah. I'm from Georgia and went to graduate school in Michigan at Hillsdale College, where I did a dissertation on John Taylor of Caroline, who's a lesser known figure, but was a person who had some significant influence, I think, on Thomas Jefferson. And so in my dissertation, I got to interact with a lot of the thought of Thomas Jefferson. And then in 2021, I was able to be a fellow at Monticello at the Thomas Jefferson Library Center, and got to spend a month there doing some research.
They love me there, Clifford. I don't know if you know.
I know, I'm sure they do.
I've been invited there thousands of times.
Well, the research I did there was on Nicholas Trist, who married Jefferson's granddaughter, Virginia. And specifically, I was looking at Trist's, what he called a defense of Jefferson from the charge of supporting nullification. And that was in regard to the actual nullification crisis of the 1830s. And Trist was working hand in glove with Madison, really to try to prevent South Carolina from using Jefferson in defense of nullification. This is really interesting because, as we're going to find in his Kentucky resolutions, at least the first draft, he very much seems to endorse the idea and even uses the word nullification, which wasn't really used a whole lot before 1828. So anyway, that's kind of how I got here, and now I work for the Florida Department of Education. All of these opinions are just my own; they don't reflect that of the department. And I enjoy working here in the Division of Florida Colleges. So before this, I was working at Troy University in Alabama, and I was directing their Center for Leadership Development. And before that, I actually had the chance to help found a new college called Thales College in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Wasn't there a philosopher by that name, by the way?
The very first one, in fact. That's right.
I'm teasing. Yes, I was an ancient Greek scholar.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I knew that. Yeah. Thales of Miletus. So, that's right.
Well, good. Glad to have you. And
oh wow, we have a lot.
We've got so Clifford's an expert on the issue of nullification, and he's going to share his thoughts with the Kentucky resolutions and ping pong back between them and the Virginia resolutions, and hopefully get us clear on just where Jefferson really stood on this, or either that or he's going to obfuscate the hell out of the issue, one or the other, but that's all right. All right, why don't we get the first question, Donna? Donna, you said you're going to have to leave at 5:30, right?
Yes, I was just getting ready to mention that to the audience that you'll see me just fade into the background. I'll be disappearing about 5:30. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Question number 1, Dr. Holochek, what of this quasi war with France? Just how real was the threat to France? Just how real was the threat of France to the United States?
Well, that itself is a matter of some debate. I think if you're a Federalist, you're going to say the threat is very real and very sincere. If you're a Republican, a radical Republican at the time, you're probably going to argue that it wasn't so bad. It also depends on whether you're pro-France or pro-England, too. The Federalists tended to be pro-England and the Republicans pro-France. And there's a lot of ravelment. There's a lot of
Donna, am I? Did we lose Dr. Holochek here?
No, I'm here.
Hello.
No, I'm here. Anyways, what I'll say is, in 1778, there was something called the Treaty of Alliance, and that was after during the Revolutionary War, and the U.S. was pledged to protect the French interests in, because of their succor in the Revolutionary War. The U.S. pledged to protect French interests in the West Indies. And at the same time, 1778, France had the status of a favored nation status when it came to commercial trade. Now, 1792, we get the French Revolution that's happening, and then later on, Napoleon comes to power. So from 1792 to 1797, there is something called the War of the First Coalition. This is a coalition of states allied against France, Austria, Prussia, England, the Netherlands, for instance. And really, the key issue is with the revolution, with the beheading, the guillotine of Louis XVI, which is in 1793, France is in a state of chaos, and no one knows where things are going to go in France with the revolutionists. Jefferson's not as excited about this as other people. So Louis XVI is killed in 1793. There's a state of chaos. The Federalist-dominated Congress suspends repayment of French loans. So France can't be too happy with that, right? It loaned out money to the U.S. government for the Revolutionary War effort and everything. And so there's a suspension of repayment of loans. In some sense, it's reasonable because we don't know what sort of government, we're paying to until there's some sort of stability. Now, in 1793 as well, and this is something I'd like to do, Donna, on the next 1 Word 5 Questions. Jefferson pens something called Opinions on French Treaties. And he's giving, it's a very elaborate argument that he's arguing to George Washington in this memorandum or so that countries really are, the heart and soul of a country is its people. At least that's what Jefferson thinks. So he thinks if there's a change of government officials, there's not necessarily a change of government. It's a complex argument, and I want to look into this a little bit more because I think there are some problems with the argument, in spite of Jefferson's intuitions, which seem really good. So there's a lot of craziness going on, and George Washington in 1793 is pushing for the United States to have a neutral route in all of this, which of course is impossible. 1794, we get the Jay Treaty, which is crafted by Alexander Hamilton and given the succor of George Washington. That gets passed, and it shifts the alliance from away from France towards England. And of course, a lot of Jeffersonians are not too happy with this. So the question is America, there's this quasi war going on, and there's this treaty, War of the First Coalition. France and England are at war. Does America support France? Does it support England? Where are we going to go? New Englanders don't want any, they want full involvement with trade with all countries. So they want neutrality, so they can do that. What happens at this time is because of the Jay Treaty, France starts seizing American ships. And so the U.S., the quasi-war was all about, it wasn't an official declared war, but it was like a naval skirmishes off the Atlantic coast, in the Caribbean area, in the Atlantic Ocean, so forth, between French and American ships. And the United States really didn't have much of a navy at the time. So there's a lot of confusion going on here. And right, so the alien, this is all this is all part of the impetus for the Alien and Sedition Acts, pushed forward through the Adams administration, as you mentioned in your introduction. But behind it, there's the question of what's going on with France, the zaniness in France. Do they really pose a significant threat to overthrow the U.S. government, as some Federalists are saying, or is it really not much of a threat at all? It's just some naval skirmishing. So I'll leave it at that. That's certainly a highly incomplete picture, but it's a very, very complicated scenario.
Wow, it doesn't seem like much has changed.
No, things never change, do they?
With the division. Yeah, so the more I learn about history and the disagreements of the past, I realize that what we see today isn't really much different than what's been going on for hundreds of years. Question number 2, this is for Dr. Humphreys. The tension between U.S. and France was real, yet did the skirmishes between U.S. and France warrant the Alien and Sedition Acts?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, I think, because were they warranted? I think you have to look at what the quasi-war, as Mark was just saying, what it revealed about the politics at the time, and that was that there was a total lack of trust. Federalists didn't trust Republicans, and Republicans didn't trust Federalists. They all thought that, in other words, there was no objective. People didn't think you could look at a situation objectively and come at it and say, well, is this good for America or not, without thinking, well, they're biased by their view about England or France or something like that. And so in the midst of this just hotbed of lack of trust, Jefferson comes up with Madison with this proposal for responding to these acts. So I think there are 3 things you have to bear in mind to answer the question: were the Alien and Sedition Acts warranted given the threat with France? One thing I would have just added to the mix that we don't have to get into, but is the XYZ affair, which included this charge of bribery, and it just looks like corruption and nefariousness. So not only is there lack of trust between people in the parties of Federalists and Republicans, but now citizens are wondering, can we even trust our government? And the U.S. kind of blew the whistle on it and said there's this corruption in this with these French bureaucrats, and we don't want to deal with them. So it was just a mess. So the 3 things I think you have to really bear in mind is that there had already been, from the previous big debate in American history over ratification of the Constitution, there had already been people blowing the whistle about certain clauses in the Constitution, particularly the General Welfare Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause. And as we'll get into the resolutions, Jefferson goes right in there. So people were already looking for something that would be exploited and justified on the basis of the general welfare or the necessary and proper clause. And so Sedition Act and the Alien Acts, these were justified on the basis that they were necessary for the general welfare and necessary and proper for fulfilling what was legitimate powers. That was the claim. So that suspicion is brought right back to the surface. Aha, this is exactly what we told you was going to happen. And that debate was still very, very fresh. The second thing that I think you have to bear in mind is that because of the Sedition Act, if you're a citizen and you have a problem with this act, you're not able to write an op-ed, let's say, in a newspaper, calling for public opinion to vote another, because you might be accused of sedition in that very act. So what was required was something that would be a sort of statewide response, and so the trying to figure out, was the Sedition Act warranted? Was the threat to France so bad? The only way you can answer that is if you say, well, what do you lose? What's the cost of something like the Sedition Act? Well, what you've done is you've effectively silenced opposition, and you've silenced the whole mechanisms of free government as Jefferson understood it. And so he would say, no, it cannot be warranted, never warranted.
The dialectic of free government, the exchange, the collision and exchange of ideas.
Right. And then the third and final thing that I think is important for just considering about all of this is that for us, the Supreme Court, as a legitimate body of appeal, a court for problems that arise for things that may or may not be constitutional, for us, that's sort of natural, and there's a lot of precedent now for it. But in 1798, that wasn't really an option in people's minds. Marbury v. Madison isn't established until 1803, which solidifies the concept of judicial review. And so, when people are thinking now about laws that may or may not be constitutional, if I'm a Federalist lawmaker, and I'm a big fan of the Federalist administration and the agenda, I'm not thinking, well, there's this mechanism, the Supreme Court, which may check what we're doing here. That's not. No one knows. What do you do with a law that may or may not be constitutional? There has not been a process to sort of check those yet. So that's another thing that might lead someone, if you're trying to get into the minds of the people at the time, which is what I think we should be trying to do, and they're asking themselves, is this warranted? They don't have, like we would probably have now, well, it may be warranted, but that's certainly going to lead to a lawsuit. We need to tailor this in such a way that it has a more likelihood of surviving. And I'm just pointing out they didn't have that as a kind of mental check. So again, was it warranted in the minds of the Federalists? Yeah, absolutely. And there's no such thing as the Supreme Court that's going to do judicial review and check this thing. And if you're a Republican, you're definitely going to say absolutely not, because for the reasons that Jefferson lays out, I think pretty clearly, at least the Constitution.
For the reasons, if you look at the Sedition Act, for example, a lot of the people that were jailed and accused of sedition just happened to be Republicans who were voicing opinions other than what the Federalists were articulating. Callender, for example, and other such people.
Right, and let's point out that was a lawmaker. That was a legislator who was jailed under the Sedition Act, and so this was like tailor made for Jefferson to respond to and say, this is exactly the kind of tyranny that we fought the Revolution to avoid, and all of the limits in government that we put into the Constitution was meant to prevent this. So I think this sort of
you mentioned the Supreme Court to be the final arbiter, and that's all fair and good, but Jefferson's view consistently was he hated the Supreme Court, having the judiciary elected for life and having sole say over interpretation of the Constitution. He thought each branch of the government should have its own say in interpretation. Right. Now, what do you do? Well, how do you resolve difficulties and problems? He never tells that, but in some sense, I like his intuitions. I do. I don't like the.
I agree, but you got to appreciate all of the irony that goes into that, right? The Madison v. Marbury case happens because Jefferson tried to withhold judicial appointments that Adams made the midnight appointments, those last hours in as president. So this is something that was meant to be a check on Jefferson to begin with, that he tried to prevent, and it's that very case that ends up establishing what we know as judicial review, which agree with it or not, or think that there may be some legitimacy to it, but it's the idea that the Supreme Court is the final arbiter on what is and is not constitutional. I agree with you. Jefferson's a departmentalist. Each branch should be able to speak to the constitutionality of a law. Absolutely. But then the third final element, and the irony of that thing, is that Madison was the one who, at the Constitutional Convention, was claiming that if the federal government doesn't have a veto on state laws that the federal government deems unconstitutional, then the whole project won't work. And so here's Madison now on the other side of that situation. Anyway, the irony is just rich. And if you like history, this is one of those situations where you're just thinking, this is
and it's almost, and part of the confusion and the ravelment to which you're alluding or referring is just, it's a young country, and we just fought a Revolutionary War, and easy to say, people don't know where they're quite going yet, and there's a lot of happenstance. Now, it's not like when you fight a revolution, you know why you're fighting it to some sense, but then what do you do after you're successful? That's another can of worms. So there's a lot of confusion because it's a very young country, and in effect, the eyes of the world are on the United States to see what they're going to do if they can create this successful government that they boasted they can. Anyways, question 3, Donna, what do you think?
Question 3, yes, I'll read question 3 and then I'll disappear. Okay, when looking at Thomas Jefferson's first draft of the Kentucky Resolutions, what sticks out to you?
Clifford, do you have anything? I mean, we're looking at presumably what his first draft is, and hopefully you're still there. I don't know if your internet has gone out.
He looks frozen.
Yeah, the internet might have gone out. I can start this off to some extent and just say, two, of course, it's an extraordinarily lengthy draft. And that's what you would expect of Thomas Jefferson, I guess, is he's a master of prolixity. So that's one of the problems that you have here. There you are. Is your internet going in and out on us? You're
not on my end. I'm not sure what the problem is.
All right, but I've been talking. I mean, so one of the things I'm talking, two obvious things that stick out are Thomas Jefferson articulating rather cleanly states' rights view. And this is something that was an offshoot of the Articles of Confederation, and this notion of nullification, about which you're going to talk. And I'm going to leave that, not say much about nullification, because I think when you read his first draft, I'll do the questions for Donna. It's not clear, even when he uses the term nullification, just what he means by that. Is he empowering the states themselves? Does he suggest that the states should disobey the federal government? That might not be what he's saying. It doesn't necessarily follow from what he writes that that's the case. Or is he arguing rather strongly that the states should just disregard federal legislature, like the Alien and Sedition Acts, and just disobey? In some sense, his sentiment is there. When a law is improperly or illegally formed, the notion of states' rights is also this notion of strict construction of the Constitution. What the Constitution does not articulate, if the Constitution doesn't give you certain powers, the federal government can't assume those powers. And then the second thing is nullification. So I'm going to leave this issue of nullification for you because you got a take on that. And I'm going to go to the fourth question that Donna was going to ask. I'll ask it of you, Clifford, and give us your take. In the eighth resolve, Jefferson writes, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, nullification of the act is the rightful remedy, that every state has a natural right in cases not within the compact to nullify their own authority on all assumptions of power by others within their limits. What is he talking about? Is he, as I said, is he asking? Go ahead.
Yeah. if I apologize if I do jip out, you can carry on. But right. So I mean, this is really complicated for a number of reasons. It's a minefield waiting for us to trip on something and be confused or to confuse others. So first off, we have to remember that Jefferson had no notion of the nullification crisis and like what John C. Calhoun articulated. Is that Jefferson's position? It's hard to say. I know Calhoun denounces Jefferson, so we got to think Calhoun didn't think that he agreed with Jefferson, but maybe on this issue. So, but anyway, you have to understand we're not talking about what's connected to the tariff of abominations or what may have had implications about slavery. That's later. Jefferson is not talking about that. So the other thing that we have to figure out is that Jefferson is clearly speaking in terms of social contract theory. And you'll notice in all of the resolves except one, he has this phrase that says, "It is true. It's generally true. It's being true as a general principle." And then he goes on to declare, defend it in front of in the Constitution. And that means he's basing his argument on two things. One is, like you said, a strict construction of the Constitution. This is what the words in the Constitution are. But secondly, and I think he would say more forcefully, there are certain things that you don't have to write down that are assumed in any contract to be important. And if you don't have those things, the whole contract itself is invalid. And so his logic here depends both on those, what you might call constitutional and extra constitutional logic. And you have to ask if you're persuaded of that.
What is the extra constitutional logic, the sort of implicit things to which you're
well, this is another really fine distinction we have to bear in mind, is that there was a development in constitutional Republican thought between somebody like Algernon Sidney and John Locke they're using the same language, and it sounds like social compact theory, but they're two very different ones. And John Taylor, who had an influence on Jefferson, like I said, really spells this out. And the first one is, if you look at something like Magna Carta, there was this idea that the government has an arrangement with the people, and there are two parties who are contracting together, both with rights and duties. And for a long time, that seemed like good Republican theory, and that's how you keep a monarch, but you keep him in check. The Americans, through John Locke, after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, rejected that. And they said, no, the government is not a party, because if a legitimate party to a contract has an equal say and has standing to appeal, to say this person didn't uphold their, and I get to be an equal arbiter of whether they fulfilled their contract or not. The Americans throw that out. Jefferson doesn't follow that. What he understands is that the parties to the compact are the sole people who get to decide if the contract has been broken. The government in this case is not one of the parties. The government, as he says multiple times, is a product of the parties. So what you described as states' rights is a.
And that's what he says in the opinion of the French treaties. That's the basis of his argument. The government is
okay.
So the government is the people.
That's right. They are the only ones who are at the table, and they decide, hey, let's all get together and let's create a government. And that's how he understands what he did. So I think it's critical to see Jefferson, I don't think in this way, doesn't really see the United States of America itself as a nation. He sees the states as independent nations that created a government. Right, that created a
that's what's going
government
on here, it seems. And that's what's behind the states' rights thing. Yeah.
That's right.
Go ahead.
That's right.
I like what you're saying. I think that's right.
Yeah. Well, so if you want to understand, especially the eighth resolution and his logic here, the passage right before the passage that you quoted.
Could you read that? I'm looking at it.
Yeah. Okay. So he makes a distinction here. It's really important. He says, in cases of an abuse of delegated powers, the members of the general government being chosen by the people, a change by the people would be constitutional remedy. So whenever you've got delegated powers and they abuse those powers, the rightful remedy is to elect new people in there, to use the constitutional processes and normal politics and correct that abuse. But he says, when there has been, where powers are assumed, which have not been delegated at all, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. So what he's saying here is the Alien and Sedition Act is not an abuse of delegated powers. It's wholly different from that. It's actually assuming completely different powers that were never delegated. And that's why he says we can't rely on the normal politics to fix this problem. We have to go outside of that and rely on nullification, which he goes on to explain in terms of using state powers to prevent the exercise of that power that the federal government is assuming. So in his
your
mind,
take, he's championing the states to intervene when the federal government is. So he's really making a strong statement here. The states have the power to nullify and just disobey the law.
Well,
Madison
critically,
doesn't want to go there, does he?
No, not at all. Critically, he doesn't say they not only do they have the power, they may or may not have the power, but more importantly, he says they have the natural right.
Right. Yes.
And
so that's a different ballgame. So say something more about that, because power is an ambiguous word. It means, the ability to act on something.
Sure.
So if he's just talking about a natural right, he's making a naturalistic claim, but he's not telling the states necessarily that just disregard what the federal government's doing.
Well, as I read it, he's relying on the same logic that they used to justify the American Revolution to begin with. When he pens the Declaration, it's not really clear if he thinks that the United States has the power to throw off Britain. They probably don't. I mean, if you're just looking at the situation at the time, but he says regardless, they have the right to. And he says in the Declaration, in his draft, in the final draft, right, that just because you have the right to throw off a government that's been long established doesn't mean it's prudent, right? You have to calculate that. It may not be in your power to do it, but that distinction that we're talking about between power and right is vital here. And so a right by itself is powerless. And so what he calls for in this draft is for the establishment of a committee of representatives of different states who can speak for their states. And I think what he's
this
hoping,
committee is not any branch of the federal government.
Right. Yeah. And critically, that gets around the problem of being arrested for sedition, because you can't arrest a state. You can arrest an individual, but someone who's speaking for the state, which is why the Kentucky resolutions, the Virginia resolutions, you can't arrest a state legislature for resolving something, right? So it was critically a way to get around that sedition problem that I think was essential.
That's why he's going to the Virginia legislatures, going to the Kentucky legislatures, because of, on your take, because of he's appealing to the states, the people of the
That's right. Yeah. And originally he was gonna write the resolutions for North Carolina. That was who the Kentucky resolutions were originally intended for. And there was an election in North Carolina that I guess installed a number of Federalists that he thought, no way, it's not going to pass. So he goes with Kentucky instead. What's the importance of that? Well, North Carolina is one of the original 13. It's an established state. It's got people who signed the Declaration of Independence, people he thought he could rely on. Kentucky.
Hi, it's Dr. Mark Holacek again, and we're back with Dr. Clifford Humphrey. We had some connectivity problems yesterday, so today we're going to finish up what we were talking about yesterday. And we were interrupted with our issues when Dr. Humphrey was talking about why Jefferson went to Kentucky, to the Kentucky legislature, and so forth. If you want to finish up your thought on that, then we'll get to the last question. We'll summarize, Clifford.
Yeah, the only significance, I think, of the choice of Kentucky is that it shows that Jefferson was a little desperate, I think, because Kentucky would have been the last choice. It was brand new state, had zero prestige or influence. It was a frontier. It wasn't a place that would have garnered the respect like a Virginia would have, or his first choice, North Carolina. So that just tells me that Jefferson was really desperate to try and find a state with a state legislature that was solidly Republican, that he could count on to pass this through without having Federalists try and disrupt it, as he suspected would have happened had he gone with North Carolina, which was his first choice.
So he had to have an outlet. Okay. Anyway, let's get to the last question, and this is sort of like a meat and potatoes question here. You have a particular take on Jefferson's Kentucky resolution, so forth. And a lot of it has to do, at least he told me personally in the communication, that it has something to do with a letter from to Wilson Carey Nicholas in 1798 on October 4th. Now, I'm going to read what Jefferson writes to Wilson Carey Nicholas, and if you could please elaborate on why this is such a significant letter and what this means for Jefferson. And again, I'll just let readers know there's so much going on in Jefferson's first draft of his Kentucky resolutions, so we necessarily have to be selective. And what we've been doing is talking a little bit about the states' rights, strict constructionism, and Dr. Humphrey's focusing his main interest here is on nullification, what Jefferson meant. So we're going to try to wrap up and get clear on that. So Jefferson writes, the more I have reflected on the phrase in the paper you showed me, the more strongly I think it should be altered. Suppose you were to, instead of the invitation, to cooperate in the annulment of the acts, to make it an invitation. And he's quoting here, to concur with this Commonwealth in declaring, as it does hereby declare, that the said acts are and were ab initio null, void, and of no force or effect. And that's presumably what Nicholas has said. He says, I should like it better if that were included. So what is the significance of this particular letter? Why did it grab your attention so much? And what does that tell us about Jefferson nullification?
Yeah. The first thing you have to understand is the climate that they're in right now, which is that Jefferson, who's always got a little bit of a paranoia about him, is especially paranoid right now. The guy's the vice president. He can't be caught meddling in these kinds of things that would undermine his boss, John Adams, the president of the United States, in a way. So, and he's terrified of the Sedition Act. They've already locked up one legislator who's to say he's not next. And it would be a convenient way if you were running for president and you suspected the guy who was going to be running against you might have a good shot. You might want to lock him up. That would be a good way of shutting it down. We can kind of relate to that now. Yeah. So the problem with trying to understand this story is so much is not put in writing. So much of what happens with Jefferson and Madison happens in person when they're meeting together. And Jefferson's very careful about what he's going to write down, because he knows that there's a chance always that the mail could be intercepted and that it could be put in a newspaper and he could be his name be drawn into this controversy. So you're always having to read a little bit between the lines. And so the few letters that we do have really from June to December of 1798 from Jefferson are really valuable. He obviously has to take some risks because he has to communicate with people, but as much as possible, he's doing that in person. So what I have to read between the lines here is that Wilson Carey Nicholas brought a copy of Madison's Virginia resolutions to Monticello for Jefferson to read, I guess wouldn't have been at Monticello, wherever he was at the time, might have been Monticello. And he reads them there, and he's responding to Carey Nicholas, and he notice he doesn't say, the draft from Madison about the Virginia. He doesn't mention any of that. It shows us that he's careful. He just more reflected on the phrase in the paper you showed me. Right, he's being very oblique here, but it's important. He risked putting this in writing, which means he thought this was really important. This wasn't an offhand, I should like it better if it had this little flair. No, he's taken a risk in putting this in writing, which means he thinks this is a really important point.
Well, he's been thinking about it quite a bit from the more I've reflected. So it's been brewing in him in some sense. Speaking of brewing,
that's right.
Yeah, so it's like you said.
That's right.
He had to give vent to this notion.
Yeah,
and
we know, because we've been reading the Kentucky resolutions, his first draft at least, how he understands how forceful. So the degree that this has to do, and the kind it has to be the kind of thing that is forceful, and it interrupts federal power. And when he reads Madison's draft of the Virginia resolutions, he thinks it's too soft. He thinks it doesn't say the same kind of thing, or at least it doesn't rise sufficiently to the level to say the minimum of what he thinks it needs to say in order for there to be cooperation between Kentucky and Virginia. This is supposed to be a dual thing at the same time that's going to start this groundswell in the country. And so he says it really needs to include this phrase. And so we see null, void, and of no force or effect there. And what's the rest of the story is Wilson Carey Nicholas inserts that into the draft following Jefferson's instructions, gives it to John Taylor of Caroline to introduce into the Virginia legislature, and nobody tells Madison. So Madison just happens to be in the county when this is being debated by the Virginia legislature, and John Taylor reads the resolutions with this phrase. Word gets back to Madison. Madison, I mean, I'm telling the story here. I'm piecing things together. I don't know. Madison, I think, clearly didn't like it, and was able to communicate back to people in the legislature that exact phrase needs to be cut out. And so that's exactly what happens.
So what do you think? Why is Madison objecting? It's very strong language on Jefferson's part. So what does Madison in particular find so offensive with it? What's so wrong with strong? I know Madison's a more moderate, down-to-earth person. Jefferson's sort of the idealist. But what might you think that Madison would have found highly, not just objectionable, highly objectionable?
Well, Madison can be a little hard to nail down on a few things, but he's never hard to nail down on this issue. What he says during the Constitutional Convention, what he says in the Federalist Papers, what he says here, and what he says in the 1820s and the 1830s during nullification, it's fairly consistent. And that's that states do not have the authority to block in any way national power. He advocates vociferously in the Constitutional Convention for a federal veto on all state laws, which would be the opposite of this. And that's
he's a bit of a Hamiltonian there, right, at this point.
He very much is. And he writes to Jefferson right after the Constitutional Convention, completely distraught that the Constitution does not include this federal veto on state laws. Yeah. And he's so distraught he doesn't think the Constitution's gonna work. And then something happens. He meets with Hamilton. They come up with the Publius Project, and they start writing the Federalist Papers. And if you want to focus on one phrase, I think, in the Federalist Papers, look at Federalist 39, close to the end there, where he's discerning in that paper the parts of the Constitution that are federal and the parts that are national. And he kind of tallies them all up, and he's trying to show it's much more federal than national. But he tips his hand with one point, which is to say, whenever there's a conflict between what a state might think is a federal issue and what the national government thinks is a national issue, the national tribunal gets to decide. And he says it in a very kind of glib, sort of offhanded way, but which tells us this, that he has a more developed understanding of judicial review as it will be established in 1803 in Marbury v. Madison, which is, again, we've already talked about, ironic because it was a case against him. But he sees here.
You mean a more developed? You mean a prescience? Because I don't know that view is necessarily a better view than Jefferson's, but it's a different view.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think the important thing is Jefferson and Madison are in sync for a lot of things, but here clearly they are not. And Madison is completely consistent on this, as far as I can see, all the way through, which is that his understanding of the nature, which is to say the composition and the makeup and the logic of the national government, cannot work if states have the authority to block it like this. And so he sees this, I think, as a direct threat to the project that he is intimately invested in.
Jefferson has to be quite a bit nonplussed here that he, in effect, is assuming, or at least greatly hoping, that he and Madison will be on the same page in this, and he's finding out that they're not. So he's got to be radically disappointed. And
that's right.
Anyways,
that's right. Well,
go ahead.
Well, part of the research I did on Nicholas Trist, there was an historian an American historian during the Jacksonian era who interviewed Nicholas Philip Trist and asked him about his falling out with Hamilton, because I mean it's very soon after the Constitution is ratified that the two guys who were the main participants in the Federalist Project are at odds again, and they're writing essays against each other in the Helvetius Pacificus debate.
Mhm.
And so this guy asks Nicholas Trist, who was a very intimate, knew Madison intimately. He said, how is it that what led to that breakup? And he said this, which I think was really important. He said, Madison, as soon as the Constitution was ratified and the government was in motion, Madison saw that Hamilton was not was disingenuous about what he had argued and what he had said compared to what he was doing in the government. And it spooked Madison. I think he thought, oh my gosh, what have I helped put in motion now?
Frankenstein
and you
monster. Yeah. It's
right.
not
So
a
then
surprise at all. That's not a surprise.
it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. But if you think about how distraught Madison was after the Constitutional Convention, that he didn't get his federal veto and a couple other things, but that especially, I think Madison, whatever Hamilton tells him, I imagine they met in some pub and cooked up the Federalist Papers plan, and it was extremely effective. And Jefferson has high praise for it. Although there's a telling letter, which you probably are familiar with, when he says about the Federalist Papers that the authors did not say exactly what they really thought, but they said what they thought had to be said in order, for the project to work. So
that's politics, and that's part of
that's right.
That's the essence of politics, and Jefferson was no stranger to compromising.
That's
I find this all quite fascinating. I mean, I've written quite a bit on Jefferson, and oftentimes when I discuss something on the show, I am surprised to find, wow, there's a section of a book where I actually wrote a whole section on that. I've never done anything really interesting on Kentucky resolutions, other than, say, the obvious, what I talked about before. So I find this quite interesting. There's a lot going on, as you're talking about, behind the scenes, that you can get some disclosure of it by reading what we have in letters and then speculating on. Reasonably speculating, I want to say, because I think what you're doing is there's speculation, then there's reasonable speculation. I'm only interested in the latter. Now, if you would, for our viewers, I want to thank you for being with us, by the way. If you would, for our viewers, just put a summary on that. What precisely does Jefferson mean by nullification here in this letter and in his first draft? And, you hinted at this prior, but what is he arguing that the states are obliged to be doing? What are they? What should they not be doing?
Mm-hmm. So I think a straightforward reading of the Kentucky resolutions reveals to us Jefferson's understanding of both the fundamental assumptions that go into what is the basis of legitimacy of the federal government. And he sees it in social compact theory, where the states are the sole parties and the federal government is merely a creature of it. And all the implications that come from that. The most important one, and this is the second thing I think we should take from it, is that Jefferson sees whenever there's a conflict, the distinction we already pointed out, where he says there's a difference between an abuse of a power and an assumption of powers that were never delegated. And he says, whenever you've got the latter case on your hand, what you have to do is convene the amending tribunal, get together all the people who ratified the Constitution to begin with, to say, is this really what we intended? And so he doesn't know anything about judicial review. That's not till 1803. So 1798, he's trying to think, this is a problem that's going to keep coming up. How are we going to deal with it? And I think what the Kentucky resolutions reveals is how he understood the way for that to be resolved.
Okay, so I mean, in that, everything you're saying, I think you said a little bit earlier when you talked of the sentence or the sentiment just prior to his mentioned nullification in Resolve number 8, and that's what you're basing that on. So this is good analytic philosophy here, or analytic history, where we're actually looking at what Jefferson said and basing our strong surmise on what we conclude on that. So anyways, I want to thank you for joining us. We'll have the video coming out soon, and hopefully we can do this again. And I wish you good luck with this paper on which you're working, with both of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions and all the players involved. And I'll let viewers know that after I remove successfully, hopefully, to Michigan, I'll be doing with Donna Vitek, Jefferson on the opinions of the French treaties, which is related to this, where Jefferson, we're going to get into social compact theory that you're talking about. I'm not so attracted to putting Jefferson into that camp, because I think he's more natural rights. And of course, there might be ways of accommodating both, but I don't like putting Jefferson. But anyways, I'll talk about that. That's what we're going to do next time. I want to thank Dr. Cliff for coming on and sharing his views with us. I think it was very, very successful and enlightening section. And thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on. Happy to come on any other time and talk about Jefferson. Always a fascinating character. So.
All right. It was fun. We'll do it again. You have a great night. Bye-bye.
All right. You too. Bye-bye.